Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Australia and racism within that country. We're going to talk firstly, of course, about Islamophobia. A report has come out by a number of researchers, and this was just done on a very cursory basis. So this is not a very in-depth report, even according to the researchers themselves, saying that this needs a lot more in-depth research. But nevertheless, they surveyed about 75 mosques and found that the threat of a Christchurch-like attack is fairly high, even at this point in time. Considering the amount of attacks that mosques, imams and Muslim worshippers overall have suffered, especially between the years 2015 or 2014, I believe it is, and 2019 as well. A whole host of or ways and forms of attacks, specifically the likes of arson, physical assault, graffiti, vandalism, verbal abuse, online abuse, and hate mail. Now, this is also paralleled with the Racism Commissioner, or the Race Commissioner, pardon me, Discrimination Commissioner of Australia, saying that there is a need for an anti-racism network or framework in the country to address prejudice. And we're not talking here just about Muslims, but also against Asian Australians, certainly as we've had in many parts of the world. During this pandemic, we've had hate attacks against Asians throughout, as I said, many countries, and we've just had this big one in the US as well, in Atlanta. He also then spoke about hatred towards even Indigenous Australians and people of other ethnicities as well, saying that overall we need a comprehensive framework to deal with those sorts of racist attacks as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by our esteemed panelists who are joining us this evening from Australia. We're now joined by Dr. Greg Barton, who is a professor of global Islamic politics. He's joining us today from Melbourne. Also joining us from Melbourne is Dr. Peucker, who is a senior research fellow of the Institute for Sustainable Industries and Livable Cities at Victoria University. And joining us from Sydney is Keysar, who is the CEO of the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils. Keysar, Greg, and Mario, good evening to all three of you, and thank you for joining us today here in Scope. Keysar, let me start with you. Let's firstly talk about Islamophobia more specifically and the 75 mosques that were surveyed. As somebody who is in a position, I'm sure, who regularly hears of assaults and Islamophobic attacks, are you surprised about the kinds of numbers that are quoted here?
I'm not surprised at the numbers because we get reports from member mosques. We're an umbrella body, a big body for Muslims in Australia, and our members are all over Australia. They include mosques, Islamic centres, etc. So we, for example, the mosque that you're showing now is the largest mosque in Australia. That's the Lakemba Mosque, also referred to as Imam Ali bin Abi Talib in the previous picture. Many of our mosques have faced some form of Islamophobic attacks in the past over the years, but the situation in my view, is improving in Australia, and the community is becoming more proactive in reaching out and in demystifying Islam and making sure that a lot of the misunderstandings out there are addressed. There are also some government policies that are improving the standing of Muslims in the community. We're not in the position that we were 15 years ago. On many counts, we have improved a great deal, and I see a lot of hope for the future that we will improve even more.
All right. Let me bring Mario in on this. Mario, what are your thoughts about these statistics? And of course, you know, it's quite harrowing to hear from researchers themselves that a Christchurch-like attack may very well that there's still very much a high chance of such an attack.
Yeah, I read the research that you're referring to. I think we have to differentiate a little bit, at least at the first step, between hate crime and terrorist attacks. What we've seen, or what the research refers to, is what I would consider alleged hate crimes against Muslims that can spill over into more politically motivated attacks and incidents, as we have seen in Christchurch. So obviously hate crime and right-wing Islamophobic terrorism can be linked, and research has found that there is a link between both. I'm also not particularly surprised. I think the interesting part about that research is that it focused on the experiences in a around a mosque, which is unusual. We have seen many research that has asked Muslims in Australia how they feel and whether they have experienced racism and discrimination. And we have seen very high proportions of people from the Muslim community who have experienced racism and Islamophobia. The interesting thing about this study is that it focuses on attacks on mosques or on people near mosques. That's the difference. But it's not surprising that it happens. It happens, and it's sad that I have to say that.
Yeah. So do you think that even though we've just crossed the 2-year anniversary of the Christchurch attacks, that possibly Australia hasn't responded strongly enough to the fact that, of course, this was an Australian who carried out the attack?
I think it's hard to argue with that. I think Australia certainly needs to do more than it's currently doing. It's interesting, the Director General of ASIO, our chief intelligence body, gave an annual threat assessment yesterday and said that right-wing extremist terrorism is now accounting for 40% of the caseload that ASIO was dealing with, up from just 10-15% of the counterterrorism caseload 5 years ago. So a big increase in the sort of far-right groups that target Muslims that are known for their Islamophobia and racism. That suggests that the perception of the Muslim community of vulnerability has some basis, and we haven't done enough yet to address that, I don't think. I mean, this was the backstory to the Australian terrorist 2 years ago who shot dead 51 worshippers in Christchurch, New Zealand. He'd gone from hateful extremism to violent extremism in one fell swoop, and we still haven't yet dealt with that ideology that is clearly at large in Australian society.
Keysar, I wanted to also bring in the fact that we've had the Race Discrimination Commissioner and others within Australia, even within the Muslim community, saying that there is a need for a better framework to even just talk about hate crimes, right? So in this case now I'm talking about just beyond Muslims, but hate crimes towards a whole variety, unfortunately, of minorities in the country, including we've had Asian Australians. And do you think it's fairly logical, unfortunately, then where there is hatred towards one minority, then that very easily translates towards hatred towards others?
Look, it is right that when there's hatred towards a minority, haters tend to always look for a target. Now, just recently, we've put a submission into a government inquiry on right-wing extremism. We know that there is a parliamentary inquiry into right-wing extremism in Australia, but this is what I was referring to before, that we are now in a better position to address this problem, that the problem is coming to the surface. We are in a better position to report on these issues. So on the one hand, it might look like there's more than what happened before, but I think that's because we are now more active in the reporting field, and also we have a better reach into discussing these issues with parliamentarians and with senators, and that the government itself is starting to recognise that right-wing extremism is a threat, and that it needs to be addressed. I'm not saying that we're perfect as a society. I don't think any society is perfect. Societies need to always be dynamic, always looking out for potential problems and finding ways and means to prevent them. But I can see hope for the future, and I can see that if we continue to work on addressing these issues, that we will go a long way towards eliminating a great deal of this hatred and this Islamophobia and this xenophobia that affects also people who are not Muslim. For example, recently we had an issue with Hindu extremists in Australia who attacked a group of Sikhs after the farmers' protest in India. So they've carried the problems from India right into Australia. My organisation ended up calling for meetings with Hindu leaders, and we sat down and tried to discuss and find ways to address this problem before it gets bigger.
Yeah.
There are avenues at our disposal which are improving. There are connections and contacts, and there's the reach that gets us into the right ears to make sure that these issues are not hidden, but they are addressed, and that decision makers are trying to find solutions for these problems.
Mario, I want to obviously, Keysar there said, every society is always in motion, right? There's always, we're looking for, movement towards progress and positive change. Do you think that there is positive change in the air for Australia when it comes to this issue? Because, at the same time, and again, looking from this as a non-Australian, we've had also the Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, who has made statements in the past, which I'm sure you're well aware of, talking about how Victorians are scared to go out at night because of African gang violence, that Australia is paying for the mistakes of the 1970s migration program, that illiterate refugees will take the jobs of Australians, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't give one a lot of hope when you have somebody who is still very much serving in office.
I think it is a special moment in time at the moment in Australia and around the world. The Black Lives Matter movement has really focused or directed the focus on racial injustices, the history, systemic issues, and that has also had an effect on Australia. So in Australia, the Black Lives Matter movement was also relatively big, obviously not as big as in the US, but there was a movement, and there still is a movement that focuses on Indigenous Australia, especially on police treatment and death in custody, for example. So there's a momentum at the moment, and I see that there is the potential of progress, and there is a reason for hope. But when we say hope, then what we have to do first is confront the ugly side of things. So, hope and progress means that we have to confront the reality of racism and Islamophobia in our country. And Australia is, collectively speaking, there are still large segments that are having difficulties in confronting the realities of racism on the ground. There's a lot of sort of denial of racism. There's a very narrow conceptualization what racism actually really is. We see that in the far right, where the argument goes that Islam is not a race, so you can be anti-Muslim, but that's not racism. Obviously, that's nonsense from an academic and also from a lived experience that I don't have, but Muslim community members have. The definition of racism, there is not a strong willingness to take on the ugliness of racism in society, and we see what the new programs, if there will be any new anti-racism programs, how they look like, whether they are only tokenistic or whether they just scratch the surface or come up with, get to know each other a little bit better and racism will go away, or whether it's going to tackle also the roots of racism, the systems of racism, the historic embedding of embeddedness of racism in Australia, because that's certainly a very deep and serious problem that affects also Indigenous communities very much. I mean, Australia was built on the idea of cultural white superiority. That's the basic idea of colonizing Australia. So there's a lot that needs to be addressed in order to move forward, and we see whether Australia as a government, as a society, has the courage to confront it.
Okay, Greg, I'll give you the final word before I let all three of you go. On this issue again of light at the end of the tunnel, I mean, do you think that within the Australian context, because, we can talk certainly about the Indigenous issue, and that's extremely important, but also if we're just talking about contemporary history and the way Australia deals with the other, right? And I'm talking about grouping all minorities within that, and especially migrants. We've had those offshore detention centers. Australia has been criticized for that for many, many, many years. And, the conditions on those detention centers are horrible. We all know that. I mean, that's just one very small example of how the other is treated in Australia, and the establishment thinks it's okay to do that. I mean, all of those issues would need to be addressed, right? I mean, I know there's a lot there to address, but do you think that the government and the people are willing to now do that on a step-by-step basis?
I think those are really important questions, Waka, and what we're seeing is contestation. This last few weeks, the biggest political issue in Australia has been about sexual assault of women. And that relates to broader concerns about Black Lives Matter and the concerns that Mario's been speaking about. But as Keysar has pointed out, working all his life in community relations, in many ways things are getting better, but there is a minority element, including amongst elected political officials and, of course, amongst more extreme elements that is pushing back against that. I think they're on the wrong side of history. I think there's a rising tide of recognition that we need to face up to our colonial past. We need to deal with racism. We need to embrace the multicultural society that Australia is. We need to deal with Islamophobia. We need to learn the lessons of Christchurch. But there is a small element that's pushing back, and some of those that small element has a loud voice in public life. And most people are horrified with the offshore detention program, and yet it persists. So clearly we need political transformation. It's a work in progress. It's not hopeless, but it is in the balance.
All right, leave there for now, but of course we appreciate Greg, Keysar, and Mario for taking their time out this evening to share their expertise with us. We were discussing their Islamophobia and a range of xenophobia within Australian society. Our guests there saying that, it seems now finally Australia has gotten the wake-up call and will possibly now deal with this sort of thing on a step-by-step basis. The Race Discrimination Commissioner has asked for a proper anti-racism framework to be set up, and that's something that even the researchers who spoke about those 75 mosques and surveyed those 75 mosques, about Islamophobia between the years 2014 and 2019 also, in fact, have advised as well at the end of their report, saying that we need a proper framework, that we can't just rely on organizations like Islamophobia Register Australia to handle all cases of Islamophobia, for example. We need one place where all hate crimes can immediately be recorded on a live basis, on a real-time basis, so the government knows how to deal with that, because according to those researchers, the possibility of a Christchurch-like attack in Australia itself is significantly high. And we know, of course, that the terrorist who carried out those attacks in Christchurch was an Australian. So Australia has a huge part to play in dealing not only, of course, with the Islamophobia, but also now in the context of what has happened in Atlanta in the U.S. against those Asian Americans. The xenophobia against Asian Australians is also equally as important to deal with. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a new bill that is in the UK that may very well pass quite soon. It has already seemingly passed, I believe, its first hurdle. This bill seemingly, according to critics and according to 150 organizations who have warned UK ministers, seems to want to curb protests, peaceful protests, that is. We're not talking about violent protests, we're talking about non-violent protests. This all, of course, comes in the wake of the death of a woman in the UK and a protest that had taken place soon after her death and after her body had been found, and the fact that a policeman was then charged with her killing. This could not be worse timing for, of course, the Johnson government. Nevertheless, within this entire bill, there is no protection for women to begin with, but secondly, it is quite wide-ranging as well. So it doesn't only affect, of course, such a protest as that took place after the killing of Sarah, but would in fact cover all other protests, such as Black Lives Matter, especially the likes of Extinction Rebellion. Priti Patel, as well as the other police officials, have also said they need further powers to be able to stop protests, which essentially create an annoyance and disturbance for businesses or otherwise, and people going about their daily lives, be it in central London or otherwise. Of course, I'm paraphrasing a lot of the bill's details there. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Chris Daw, who is a criminal barrister, legal commentator, and author of Justice on Trial. He is joining us today from London. Also joining us from the British capital today is Samir Pasha, who is a lawyer and barrister. Samir and Chris, thank you both for taking your time out this morning. Samir, let me start with you. How concerning is this? Is this, as the many human rights organizations have called, an attack on the fundamental rights of UK citizens?
Yes. So in a nutshell, yes, it is an attack on fundamental rights. It's completely draconian. It's unnecessary. A lot of the powers that they are describing that they want to bring in already exist in some form in legislation. Also, the fact is that it's going to make it very difficult for a country like the UK to talk about protests in other countries where they're being put down by, very heavy-handed governments when we are essentially going to be doing the same with this bill.
Indeed, and that's what one wonders, Chris. At this point, does the UK really need this as well? Because, Patel and police officials believe that they do.
Let's call this what it is. It's a massive power grab by central government, by the Home Secretary Priti Patel, and by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, so that the Home Secretary going forward, if this legislation comes into force, which it looks likely that it will, the Home Secretary will have the power to decide which demonstrations, which protests should be designated as dangerous in some way to the public order or to the safety of the community, and the police, with the Home Secretary's permission, can go in and break up a demonstration using these new powers. So for the very first time in this country, we are going to see the Home Secretary and the police deciding when protest is legitimate, when the cause is one that should be allowed to be protested, and when it should be banned. And that is a complete break with tradition in the British Constitution, unwritten as it is, that we as British people are allowed to protest on the streets, and we're not to be told by the government when we can do so.
As if that wasn't bad enough, right, Samir, about when you cannot protest. And there's also a segment about monuments and otherwise. And of course, that's an ode to the Black Lives Matter protests, which are taking place in the UK as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually quite funny in a sense, because when I was reading the bill and when I was reading the comments and reactions from politicians, the government stated that actually, we've done quite a lot in this bill to, protect women and vulnerable women and stuff. Actually, it turns out that, any crime against, inflicting damage on a monument could, theoretically lead to a prison sentence up to 10 years, which could be more than a sexual assault matter or even rape in some cases. So I find this whole kind of, attack on monuments and having to bring in a special section on that, quite unnecessary again, because, well, we have, acts such as the Criminal Damage Act, which would cover that. We have public order acts, which cover issues such as this. So the fact is that it's not very necessary. What it essentially is that, it's an annoyance bill. And I call it an annoyance bill because it's designed to stop the kind of annoyance that some people feel when protests occur. And as a result, like Chris was saying, that it's brought on a lot more power to the police to use their discretion, which they already have quite a lot of, and the Home Office to determine when, the annoyance limit has been crossed.
So, Chris, what is this an attempt to do? I mean, certainly the government knows it cannot shut down protests, right? I mean, that's the right of everybody within any free society, as the UK would claim it is. So, I mean, what is the goal here specifically? Because public nuisance, as we know, of course, is very vague language.
This is a political bill. This is not a bill that is based genuinely around the need to maintain public order and to protect the public from dangerous individuals. This is absolutely a political bill. And take the example that Samir mentioned of the amendment to the legislation around defacement of monuments. This is a direct attack on Black Lives Matter because Priti Patel has described Black Lives Matter as dangerous and described many of the environmental protests that we've seen as being, inappropriate and something that should be cracked down on. And so this is exactly a bill to bring in the government's political agenda to attack those with which the government disagrees. And so you're absolutely right to say that we as British people have historically had a right to protest. This is a very dangerous attempt by a power-hungry government to remove from the streets of Britain the sorts of protests that you're showing on your screen right now. And in particular, one of the most offensive things of all here is the government has stepped in to protect statues of slave traders, which were being damaged in some cases by Black Lives Matter protesters, unsurprisingly perhaps given the history of slavery in this country and around the world. And the government has chosen, of all the issues, to bring in 10-year sentences for defacing the statues of slave traders whilst rapists this soft and walk away with sentences of half that. It's a disgusting, it's a disgraceful piece of legislation, and let's just hope that, sadly, we have to rely on the House of Lords to step in, we hope, to protect some of these rights that the House of Commons and the government are trying to take away.
Right, Samir, but if I may just play devil's advocate for a moment, the government says, and I'm going to quote the Home Office directly now, it said that the freedom of expression would not be undermined by this bill, that the majority of protests in England and Wales are lawful and will be unaffected by these changes. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I was a legal observer last year at the Black Lives Matters protests, and so I was on the ground at most of these protests, keeping an eye on the police. And the fact is that I've had to represent some clients who were, arrested for merely being present at the protest, maybe because they weren't.
All right, it seems we've lost Samir there. Let me go to you, Chris, with that same question then. Do you think that the government, in this case, when it says, listen, we're not going to be blocking the majority of protests, that it's right?
Well, they're right. They won't block the majority of protests. They won't block fox hunting protests from Conservative supporters. They won't block Brexit supporting protesters. They'll only block the protesters they disagree with. So the majority of protests that they're not interested in or that accord broadly with the government's viewpoint won't be affected. But what we're seeing here is that the level of power given to the police and the authorities is greater than any power ever taken by central government in the United Kingdom over public protest. And so what we're seeing, for example, is that even if a single member of the public may be, quote, inconvenienced by a demonstration or a single business disrupted by a demonstration, the police can step in and prevent it. And in particular, there are severe restrictions on the right to protest in and around Parliament. So you would think that one of the many purposes of public protest, but probably the most central one, is to alert other people, whether they are members of the public, whether they are politicians, to the issue. And what the government is looking to do is shut down that protest, take it away from Parliament, move it away from the earshot of politicians, move it away from the earshot of members of the public. So you'll end up with protesters having to protest on their own somewhere privately where the government disagrees with the issue that they're protesting about. And these powers, once they've been given to the government, let's get real, what happens around the world? A government takes power away from the people, they're not going to give it back again.
And Samir, you were talking there about people you've had to represent from the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, if, for example, this does pass, how much harder does this make life for those like yourself who then have to represent people who come out and protest for issues, of course, that are legitimate?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to make life a bit more difficult in the sense that we would have to make a lot more representations towards the police. We'll have to make a lot more representations in court, and we're going to have to, continue kind of, challenging the discretion that the police have applied or would have applied when they decided that they wanted to arrest somebody that fell within this statute. I was saying before, I've represented, some clients who were arrested at the Black Lives Matter protest. And essentially what happened is, we had a client who had, no criminal record whatsoever, completely clean record. And because he was arrested at one protest outside the US Embassy, the police decided, in all of their infinite wisdom, to impose a bail condition where he would be banned from attending any protest, whether it's Black Lives Matter or any other protest. And that gives you a glimpse into how heavy-handed the police can get when they want to really stamp down on somebody exercising their right. And, we put forward representations that how can you stop somebody exercising their fundamental right to protest, when you are banning them from attending any protest? It's just completely disproportionate, much like this bill is. So I'm not surprised, but it's going to make life a lot more difficult, mostly, and mainly for the clients.
Okay, so Chris, as an old word then, before I let both of you go, Why isn't there more uproar about this? I mean, yes, I know that there are a lot of people who are very, very worried, but do you think it's because people are distracted with the pandemic and Brexit and all of the above that there isn't more uproar, or do you think that there is enough uproar? I mean, I feel like this isn't a big enough issue, hasn't been made of this as it should be.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is a significant amount of uproar about this. There have been some public protests about this legislation. But sadly, the government came to power in December of 2019 and won a big majority with Priti Patel promising just this sort of legislation, talking about cracking down on certain individuals and certain types of demonstration, talking about increasing prison sentences for a whole range of crimes, talking about giving the police more and more powers. I'm not sure the police even want these powers. I mean, the thing that I'm really concerned about here is, police officers in this country, in Britain, have always policed by consent. And once you place the police in direct opposition and physical and violent opposition to members of the public going about their lawful business and exercising their lawful right to protest, it creates a dangerous precedent for the relationship of the public with the police. And so that's very concerning. But to answer your central question, I think we are seeing the government try to smuggle this legislation through under the COVID pandemic umbrella. Because we already have all of these restrictions. We've had so many of our rights taken away over the last 12 months. And the government are trying to sneak this through at a time when the public are looking the other way and thinking about something else.
Yeah. Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Chris and Samir for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their insight with us. We were discussing there this is essentially anti-protest bill, if we're completely honest, and that is how it should be termed. What kind of example will this set then for the rest of the world, right? As our guests are mentioned, I mean, you lose moral authority then as a country if then you point to others and say, hey, you can't crack down on protests, but we can, with this kind of legislation that is set to be passed by all means, seemingly, by the UK government right now, targeting Black Lives Matter, whoever it does target, but it's wide-ranging enough that it can essentially be used against any protest that the government or police deem are inconvenient or a public nuisance. I mean, those are such vague words that really you can use this to any political means and to any political end that you so wish, depending on who is in power. And that in and of itself goes against the entire grain of what the purpose of peaceful protests are. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar, visiting the final segment of today's show. We're going to discuss once again, as we have a number of times previously, the drone warfare program on the part of the United States around the world. Now, we know that under President Obama, there was an attempt to be more transparent about civilian casualties and drone strikes that took place around the world. Donald Trump removed that measure of transparency during his time in office. And now that Biden has come into office, there is a request on the part of many for him to bring back that sort of transparency. Now, that is not to say that under Obama everything was completely rosy and good either when it came to those drone attack numbers, because there was a lot of doubts about whether or not there was complete transparency on the part of even the Obama administration. As we know, drone strikes went up significantly during Obama's tenure as well in office, and of course, in logically then speaking, civilian casualties, or what is known as quote unquote collateral damage, also then increased under the Obama administration as well. Will Biden be more transparent? There is seemingly a review underway right now by the Biden administration regarding how exactly to report on drone strikes to the American public as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Stephen Eric Bronner, who is a co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. He's also part of the Board of Governors and is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Rutgers University. He's joining us this morning from Fort Lee, New Jersey. Stephen, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. How important is it for there to be complete transparency when it comes to drone strikes?
This is part of, well, first of all, good morning. I think this quest for transparency is part of a project that goes back to the end of the Vietnam War, which was the first time that in the history of the United States, that everyday people in masses really wanted to become part of the process. That is to say, actually learn what the State Department was doing, what the government was doing in foreign affairs. The desire for transparency regarding the use of drones, which has been an odd part of our policy here, is crucial. The American public has a right to know, and actually the international public has a right to know, what is being done in the name of human rights, peace, and the American national interest. Unless such issues are transparent, and unless that, using that terrible word, collateral damage is highlighted, we don't know what price is actually being paid for the policies that are being pursued.
All right. So, as I had said, under the Obama administration, there was seemingly an attempt on the part of President Obama to be more transparent. But as you well know, I'm sure, Stephen, there was still a lot of criticism of how he handled the drone program. Is he the precedent that Biden should follow, or does Biden need to improve on that a lot?
I think President Biden is already going his own way in a number of respects, especially with regard to challenging the Republican Congress. But the basic impulse towards transparency, I think you can find with President Obama. The basic claim that was made, and whether this is true or not remains to be seen, was that the use of drones was, or that drones were employed in order to actually cut down on casualties. The precision of the drone attacks, the lack of course, of American troops would have a beneficial effect on both the American side and the side of the nation under attack. Less collateral damage would occur because the drone strikes were supposedly more precise than other methods might prove to be. And for the United States, of course, it would save or it would protect American military. Now, whether this is true remains somewhat of an open question. That's exactly the kind of question that needs to be answered.
It was back in 2013, wasn't it, Stephen, that we had a number of drone strike victims and their loved ones, their family members, essentially, of those who had passed away because of drone strikes, who visited, in fact, the U.S. and came to Congress. And I even remember at the time that there wasn't a lot of importance given to them, unfortunately, on the part of lawmakers at that time, right? It was sort of like just at the back of their mind. I know the media did cover it a bit, but it wasn't given the kind of importance that you would think it should be given, considering many of these people were innocent that were killed. Is that, do you think, the attitude that still remains, or have things changed a lot in these years?
A lot may overstate the case. I think things have changed, but there are two or three points associated with what you say that are important. The first is that basically American foreign policy is very low on the radar screen here at home. It always has been. It's unless the United States is directly being affected in something like 9/11 or what have you. Basically, most Americans, it sounds terrible to put it this way, but they don't care. The second aspect, of course, is that these drone strikes have almost all been launched against people of color in faraway nations, exotic nations, which most people in the United States, again, neither know about nor care about. It's a shattering indictment, perhaps, of my fellow citizenry, but there's nothing to be done about it. I think really that's the case.
Very well. We'll have to leave those as a final word, Stephen, but we really appreciate your taking our time out this morning to share your expertise with us. That was Stephen Bronner speaking to us there from Fort Lee, New Jersey, giving us his insight about drone strikes, which very much still continue, by the way, even under the Biden administration. But there is a request now for him to go back to the kind of transparency under the Obama administration and to hopefully better the kind of transparency that even Obama had brought forth, because there was and still is a lot of criticism even of how Obama handled drone strikes overall. A, regarding civilian casualties, and B, the transparencies that was required at that time. And I want to quote, just before going, Hina Shamsi, who's the director of the American Civil Liberties Union, and her statement was very strong, I think, on this issue. She said, over the last 20 years, the U.S. has taken a war-based policy approach that has resulted in a cascade of human rights and law of war violations. To take just one example, the U.S. program of secretive lethal strikes in multiple parts of the world has destroyed lives, primarily of people who are civilians, Muslim, Black, and brown. That's a point that Stephen there was making as well, and one that we should keep in mind, because even if this is far from sight and far from mind for many Americans, this does very much have an effect on how the rest of us outside the U.S. view the United States and its quote-unquote peace operations around the world. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.